Chapter 8 of The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8 Diplomacy, 1861. Hardly a week passed when the newspapers announced that President Lincoln had selected Charles Francis Adams as his minister to England. Once more, silently, Henry put Blackstone back on its shelf. As Friar Bacon's had sententiously announced many centuries before, time had passed. The civil law lasted a brief day; the common law prolonged its shadowy existence for a week; the law altogether, as path of education, vanished in April, 1861, leaving 1,000,000 young men planted in the mud of a lawless world, to begin a new life without education at all. They asked few questions, but if they had asked millions, they would have got no answers. No one could help. Looking back on this moment of crisis nearly 50 years afterwards, one could only shake one's white beard in silent horror. Mr. Adams once more intimated that he thought himself entitled to the services of one of his sons, and he indicated Henry as the only one who could be spared from more serious duties. Henry packed his trunk again without a word. He could offer no protest. Ridiculous as he knew himself about to be in his new role, he was less ridiculous than his betters. He was at least no public official, like the thousands of impoverished secretaries and generals who crowded their jealousies and intrigues on the President. He was not a vulture of carrion patronage. He knew that his father's appointment was the result of Governor Seward's personal friendship. He did not then know that Senator Sumner had opposed it, or the reasons which Sumner alleged for thinking it unfit. But he could have supplied proofs enough had Sumner asked for them, the strongest and most decisive being that in his opinion Mr. Adams had chosen a private secretary far more unfit than his chief. That Mr. Adams was unfit might well be, since it was hard to find a fit appointment in the list of possible candidates, except Mr. Sumner himself, and no one knew so well as this experienced Senator that the weakest of all Mr. Adams's proofs of fitness was his consent to quit a safe seat in Congress for an exceedingly unsafe seat in London, with no better support than Senator Sumner, at the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, was likely to give him. In the family history, its members had taken many a dangerous risk, but never before had they taken one so desperate. The private secretary troubled himself not at all about the unfitness of any one; he knew too little, and in fact no one, except perhaps Mr. Sumner, knew more. The President and Secretary of State knew least of all. As Secretary of Legation, the Executive appointed the editor of a Chicago newspaper who had applied for the Chicago Post Office, a good fellow universally known as Charley Wilson, who had not a thought of staying in the post or of helping the Minister. The Assistant Secretary was inherited from Buchanan's time, a hard worker but socially useless. Mr. Adams made no effort to find efficient help. Perhaps he knew no name to suggest; perhaps he knew too much of Washington; but he could hardly have hoped to find a staff of strength in his son. The private secretary was more passive than his father, for he knew not where to turn. Sumner alone could have smoothed his path by giving him letters of introduction, but if Sumner wrote letters it was not with the effect of smoothing paths. No one at that moment was engaged in smoothing either paths or people. The private secretary was no worse off than his neighbors, except in being called earlier to service. On April 13th the storm burst and rolled several 100,000 young men like Henry Adams into the surf of a wild ocean, all helpless like himself, to be beaten about for 4 years by the waves of war. Adams still had time to watch the regiments form ranks before Boston State House in the April evenings and march southward, quietly enough, with the air of business they wore from their cradles, but with few signs or sounds of excitement. He had time also to go down to the harbor to see his brother Charles quartered in Fort Independence, before being thrown with 100,000 more into the furnace of the Army of the Potomac to get educated in a fury of fire. Few things were for the moment so trivial in importance as the solitary private secretary crawling down to the wretched old Cunard steamer Niagara at East Boston to start again for Liverpool. This time the pitcher of education had gone to the fountain once too often; it was fairly broken, and the young man had got to meet a hostile world without defence or arms. The situation did not seem even comic, so ignorant was the world of its humours. Yet Minister Adams sailed for England, May 1, 1861, with much the same outfit as Admiral Dupont would have enjoyed if the Government had sent him to attack Port Royal with one cabin boy in a rowboat. Luckily for the cabin boy, he was alone. Had Secretary Seward and Senator Sumner given to Mr. Adams the rank of Ambassador and 4 times his salary, a palace in London, a staff of trained secretaries, and personal letters of introduction to the royal family and the whole peerage, the private secretary would have been cabin boy still, with the extra burden of many masters. He was the most fortunate person in the party, having for master only his father, who never fretted, never dictated, never disciplined, and whose idea of American diplomacy was that of the 18th century. Minister Adams remembered how his grandfather had sailed from Mount Wollaston in midwinter 1778 on the little frigate Boston, taking his 11-year-old son John Quincy with him for secretary, on a diplomacy of adventure that had hardly a parallel for success. He remembered how John Quincy in 1809 had sailed for Russia with himself, a baby of 2 years old, to cope with Napoleon and the Czar Alexander single-handed, almost as much of an adventurer as John Adams before him, and almost as successful. He thought it natural that the Government should send him out as an adventurer also, with a 23-year-old son, and he did not even notice that he left not a friend behind him. No doubt he could depend on Seward, but on whom could Seward depend? Certainly not on the Chairman of the Committee of Foreign Relations. Minister Adams had no friend in the Senate. He could hope for no favors, and he asked none. He thought it right to play the adventurer as his father and grandfather had done before him, without a murmur. This was a lofty view, and for him answered his objects, but it bore hard on cabin boys, and when in time the young man realized what had happened, he felt it as a betrayal. He modestly thought himself unfit for the career of adventurer, and judged his father to be less fit than himself. For the first time America was posing as the champion of legitimacy and order. Her representatives should know how to play their role. They should wear the costume. But in the mission attached to Mr. Adams in 1861, the only rag of legitimacy or order was the private secretary, whose stature was not sufficient to impose awe on the Court and Parliament of Great Britain. One inevitable effect of this lesson was to make a victim of the scholar, and to turn him into a harsh judge of his masters. If they overlooked him, he could hardly overlook them, since they stood with their whole weight on his body. By way of teaching him quickly, they sent out their new Minister to Russia in the same ship. Secretary Seward had occasion to learn the merits of Cassius M. Clay in the diplomatic service, but Mr. Seward's education profited less than the private secretary's, Cassius Clay as a teacher having no equal, though possibly some rivals. No young man, not in government pay, could be asked to draw from such lessons any confidence in himself, and it was notorious that for the next 2 years the persons were few indeed who felt, or had reason to feel, any sort of confidence in the Government, fewest of all among those who were in it. At home, for the most part, young men went to the war, grumbled, and died. In England they might grumble or not, no one listened. Above all, the private secretary could not grumble to his chief. He knew surprisingly little, but that much he did know. He never labored so hard to learn a language as he did to hold his tongue, and it affected him for life. The habit of reticence, of talking without meaning, is never effaced. He had to begin it at once. He was already an adept when the party landed at Liverpool, May 13, 1861, and went instantly up to London, a family of early Christian martyrs about to be flung into an arena of lions under the glad eyes of Tiberius Palmerston. Though Lord Palmerston would have laughed his peculiar Palmerston laugh at figuring as Tiberius, he would have seen only evident resemblance in the Christian martyrs, for he had already arranged the ceremony. Of what they had to expect the Minister knew no more than his son. What he or Mr. Seward or Mr. Sumner may have thought is the affair of history, and their errors concern historians. The errors of a private secretary concerned no one but himself, and were a large part of his education. He thought on May 12th that he was going to a friendly government and people, true to the anti slavery principles which had been their steadiest profession. For 100 years the chief effort of his family had aimed at bringing the government of England into intelligent cooperation with the objects and interests of America. His father was about to make a new effort, and this time the chance of success was promising. The slave States had been the chief apparent obstacle to good understanding. As for the private secretary himself, he was, like all Bostonians, instinctively English. He could not conceive the idea of a hostile England. He supposed himself, as one of the members of a famous anti-slavery family, to be welcome everywhere in the British Islands. On May 13th he met the official announcement that England recognized the belligerency of the Confederacy. This beginning of a new education tore up by the roots nearly all that was left of Harvard College and Germany. He had to learn, the sooner the better, that his ideas were the reverse of truth; that in May, 1861, no one in England, literally no one, doubted that Jefferson Davis had made or would make a nation, and nearly all were glad of it, though not often saying so. They mostly imitated Palmerston, who, according to Mr. Gladstone, desired the severance as a diminution of a dangerous power, but prudently held his tongue. The sentiment of anti-slavery had disappeared. Lord John Russell, as Foreign Secretary, had received the rebel emissaries, and had decided to recognize their belligerency before the arrival of Mr. Adams, in order to fix the position of the British Government in advance. The recognition of independence would then become an understood policy, a matter of time and occasion. Whatever Minister Adams may have felt, the first effect of this shock upon his son produced only a dullness of comprehension, a sort of hazy inability to grasp the missile or realize the blow. Yet he realized that to his father it was likely to be fatal. The chances were great that the whole family would turn round and go home within a few weeks. The horizon widened out in endless waves of confusion. When he thought over the subject in the long leisure of later life, he grew cold at the idea of his situation had his father then shown himself what Sumner thought him to be, unfit for his post. That the private secretary was unfit for his, trifling though it were, was proved by his unreflecting confidence in his father. It never entered his mind that his father might lose his nerve or his temper, and yet, in a subsequent knowledge of statesmen and diplomats extending over several generations, he could not certainly point out another who could have stood such a shock without showing it. He passed this long day and tedious journey to London without once thinking of the possibility that his father might make a mistake. Whatever the Minister thought, and certainly his thought was not less active than his son's, he showed no trace of excitement. His manner was the same as ever. His mind and temper were as perfectly balanced. Not a word escaped. Not a nerve twitched. The test was final, for no other shock so violent and sudden could possibly recur. The worst was in full sight. For once the private secretary knew his own business, which was to imitate his father as closely as possible and hold his tongue. Dumped thus into Maurigy's Hotel at the foot of Regent Street, in the midst of a London season, without a friend or even an acquaintance, he preferred to laugh at his father's bewilderment before the waiter's "'Am an egg, sir," for breakfast, rather than ask a question or express a doubt. His situation, if taken seriously, was too appalling to face. Had he known it better, he would only have thought it worse. Politically or socially, the outlook was desperate, beyond retrieving or contesting. Socially, under the best of circumstances, a newcomer in London society needs years to establish a position, and Minister Adams had not a week or an hour to spare, while his son had not even a remote chance of beginning. Politically, the prospect looked even worse, and for Secretary Seward and Senator Sumner it was so, but for the Minister, on the spot, as he came to realize exactly where he stood, the danger was not so imminent. Mr. Adams was always one of the luckiest of men, both in what he achieved and in what he escaped. The blow which prostrated Seward and Sumner passed over him. Lord John Russell had acted, had probably intended to act, kindly by him, in forestalling his arrival. The blow must have fallen within 3 months, and would then have broken him down. The British Ministers were a little in doubt still, a little ashamed of themselves, and certain to wait the longer for their next step in proportion to the haste of their first. This is not a story of the diplomatic adventures of Charles Francis Adams, but of his son Henry's adventures in search of an education, which, if not taken too seriously, tended to humor. The father's position in London was not altogether bad; the son's was absurd. Thanks to certain family associations, Charles Francis Adams naturally looked on all British Ministers as enemies. The only public occupation of all Adamses for 150 years at least, in their brief intervals of quarrelling with State Street, had been to quarrel with Downing Street; and the British Government, well used to a liberal unpopularity abroad, even when officially rude, liked to be personally civil. All diplomatic agents are liable to be put, so to speak, in a corner, and are none the worse for it. Minister Adams had nothing in especial to complain of. His position was good while it lasted, and he had only the chances of war to fear. The son had no such compensations. Brought over in order to help his father, he could conceive no way of rendering his father help, but he was clear that his father had got to help him. To him the legation was social ostracism, terrible beyond anything he had known. Entire solitude in the great society of London was doubly desperate, because his duties as private secretary required him to know everybody and go with his father and mother everywhere they needed escort. He had no friend or even enemy to tell him to be patient. Had any one done it, he would surely have broken out with the reply that patience was the last resource of fools as well as of sages. If he was to help his father at all, he must do it at once, for his father would never so much need help again. In fact, he never gave his father the smallest help, unless it were as a footman, a clerk, or a companion for the younger children. He found himself in a singular situation for one who was to be useful. As he came to see the situation closer, he began to doubt whether secretaries were meant to be useful. Wars were too common in diplomacy to disturb the habits of the diplomat. Most secretaries detested their chiefs, and wished to be anything but useful. At the St. James's Club, to which the Minister's son could go only as an invited guest, the most instructive conversation he ever heard among the young men of his own age who hung about the tables, more helpless than himself, was "Quel chien du pays?" or "Que tu es beau aujourd'hui, mon cher?" No one wanted to discuss affairs, still less to give or get information. That was the affair of their chiefs, who were also slow to assume work not specially ordered from their courts. If the American Minister was in trouble to-day, the Russian Ambassador was in trouble yesterday, and the Frenchman would be in trouble to-morrow. It would all come in the day's work. There was nothing professional in worry. Empires were always tumbling to pieces, and diplomats were always picking them up. This was his whole diplomatic education, except that he found rich veins of jealousy running between every chief and his staff. His social education was more barren still, and more trying to his vanity. His little mistakes in etiquette or address made him writhe with torture. He never forgot the first 2 or 3 social functions he attended; one an afternoon at Miss Burdett Coutts's in Stratton Place, where he hid himself in the embrasure of a window and hoped that no one noticed him. Another was at a garden party given by the old anti-slavery Duchess Dowager of Sutherland at Chiswick, where the American Minister and Mrs. Adams were kept in conversation by the old Duchess till every one else went away except the young Duke and his cousins, who set to playing leap-frog on the lawn. At intervals during the next 30 years, Henry Adams continued to happen upon the Duke, who, singularly enough, was always playing leap-frog. Still another nightmare he suffered at a dance given by the old Duchess Dowager of Somerset, a terrible vision in castanets, who seized him and forced him to perform a Highland fling before the assembled nobility and gentry, with the daughter of the Turkish Ambassador for partner. This might seem humorous to some, but to him the world turned to ashes. When the end of the season came, the private secretary had not yet won a private acquaintance, and he hugged himself in his solitude when the story of the Battle of Bull Run appeared in the Times. He felt only the wish to be more private than ever, for Bull Run was a worse diplomatic than military disaster. All this is history, and can be read by public schools if they choose, but the curious and unexpected happened to the Legation, for the effect of Bull Run on them was almost strengthening. They no longer felt doubt. For the next year they went on only from week to week, ready to leave England at once, and never assuming more than 3 months for their limit. Europe was waiting to see them go. So certain was the end that no one cared to hurry it. So far as a private secretary could see, this was all that saved his father. For many months he looked on himself as lost or finished in the character of private secretary, and as about to begin, without further experiment, a final education in the ranks of the Army of the Potomac, where he would find most of his friends enjoying a much pleasanter life than his own. With this idea uppermost in his mind, he passed the summer and the autumn, and began the winter. Any winter in London is a severe trial. One's first winter is the most trying, but the month of December, 1861, in Mansfield Street, Portland Place, would have gorged a glutton of gloom. One afternoon, when he was struggling to resist complete nervous depression in the solitude of Mansfield Street, during the absence of the Minister and Mrs. Adams on a country visit, Reuter's telegram announcing the seizure of Mason and Slidell from a British mail steamer was brought to the office. All 3 secretaries, public and private, were there, nervous as wild beasts under the long strain on their endurance, and all 3, though they knew it to be not merely their order of departure, not merely diplomatic rupture, but a declaration of war, broke into shouts of delight. They were glad to face the end. They saw it and cheered it. Since England was waiting only for its own moment to strike, they were eager to strike first. They telegraphed the news to the Minister, who was staying with Monckton Milnes at Fryston in Yorkshire. How Mr. Adams took it is told in the Lives of Lord Houghton and William E. Forster, who was one of the Fryston party. The moment was for him the crisis of his diplomatic career; for the secretaries it was merely the beginning of another intolerable delay, as though they were a military outpost waiting orders to quit an abandoned position. At the moment of sharpest suspense, the Prince Consort sickened and died. Portland Place at Christmas in a black fog was never a rosy landscape, but in 1861 the most hardened Londoner lost his ruddiness. The private secretary had one source of comfort denied to them. He should not be private secretary long. He was mistaken, of course. He had been mistaken at every point of his education, and on this point he kept up the same mistake for nearly 7 years longer, always deluded by the notion that the end was near. To him the Trent Affair was nothing but one of the many affairs which he had to copy in a delicate round hand into his books, yet it had 1 or 2 results personal to him which left no trace on the Legation records. One of these, and to him the most important, was to put an end forever to the idea of being useful. Hitherto, as an independent and free citizen, not in the employ of the Government, he had kept up his relations with the American press. He had written pretty frequently to Henry J. Raymond, and Raymond had used his letters in the New York Times. He had also become fairly intimate with 2 or 3 friendly newspapers in London, the Daily News, the Star, the Weekly Spectator, and he had tried to give them news and views that should have a certain common character and prevent clash. He had even gone down to Manchester to study the cotton famine, and wrote a long account of his visit, which his brother Charles had published in the Boston Courier. Unfortunately it was printed with his name, and instantly came back upon him in the most crushing shape possible, that of a long satirical leader in the London Times. Luckily the Times did not know its victim to be a part, though not an official, of the Legation, and lost the chance to make its satire fatal, but he instantly learned the narrowness of his escape from old Joe Parkes, one of the traditional busybodies of politics, who had haunted London since 1830, and who, after rushing to the Times office to tell them all they did not know about Henry Adams, rushed to the Legation to tell Adams all he did not want to know about the Times. For a moment Adams thought his usefulness at an end in other respects than in the press, but a day or 2 more taught him the value of obscurity. He was totally unknown. He had not even a club. London was empty. No one thought twice about the Times article. No one except Joe Parkes ever spoke of it. and the world had other persons, such as President Lincoln, Secretary Seward, and Commodore Wilkes, for constant and favorite objects of ridicule. Henry Adams escaped, but he never tried to be useful again. The Trent Affair dwarfed individual effort. His education at least had reached the point of seeing its own proportions. Zeal was too hazardous a profession for a minister's son to pursue as a volunteer manipulator among Trent affairs and rebel cruisers. He wrote no more letters and meddled with no more newspapers, but he was still young, and felt unkindly toward the editor of the London Times. Mr. Delane lost few opportunities of embittering him, and he felt little or no hope of repaying these attentions; but the Trent Affair passed like a snowstorm, leaving the Legation, to its surprise, still in place. Although the private secretary saw in this delay, which he attributed to Mr. Seward's good sense, no reason for changing his opinion about the views of the British Government, he had no choice but to sit down again at his table and go on copying papers, filing letters, and reading newspaper accounts of the incapacity of Mr. Lincoln and the brutality of Mr. Seward, or vice versa. The heavy months dragged on, and winter slowly turned to spring without improving his position or spirits. Socially he had but one relief, and to the end of life he never forgot the keen gratitude he owed for it. During this tedious winter, and for many months afterwards, the only gleams of sunshine were on the days he passed at Walton-on-Thames as the guest of Mr. and Mrs. Russell Sturges at Mount Felix. His education had unfortunately little to do with bankers, although old George Peabody and his partner Junius Morgan were strong allies. Joshua Bates was devoted, and no one could be kinder than Thomas Baring, whose little dinners in Upper Grosvenor Street were certainly the best in London. But none offered a refuge to compare with Mount Felix, and for the first time the refuge was a liberal education. Mrs. Russell Sturges was one of the women to whom an intelligent boy attaches himself as closely as he can. Henry Adams was not a very intelligent boy, and he had no knowledge of the world, but he knew enough to understand that a cub needed shape. The kind of education he most required was that of a charming woman, and Mrs. Russell Sturges, a dozen years older than himself, could have good-naturedly trained a school of such without an effort, and with infinite advantage to them. Near her he half forgot the anxieties of Portland Place. During 2 years of miserable solitude, she was, in this social polar winter, the single source of warmth and light. Of course the Legation itself was home, and, under such pressure, life in it could be nothing but united. All the inmates made common cause, but this was no education. One lived, but was merely flayed alive. Yet, while this might be exactly true of the younger members of the household, it was not quite so with the Minister and Mrs. Adams. Very slowly, but quite steadily, they gained foothold. For some reason, partly connected with American sources, British society had begun with violent social prejudice against Lincoln, Seward, and all the Republican leaders except Sumner. Familiar as the whole tribe of Adamses had been for 3 generations with the impenetrable stupidity of the British mind, and weary of the long struggle to teach it its own interests, the 4th generation could not still quite persuade itself that this new British prejudice was natural. The private secretary suspected that Americans in New York and Boston had something to do with it. The Copperhead was at home in Pall Mall. Naturally, the Englishman was a coarse animal, and liked coarseness. Had Lincoln and Seward been the ruffians supposed, the average Englishman would have liked them the better. The exceedingly quiet manner and the unassailable social position of Minister Adams in no way conciliated them. They chose to ignore him, since they could not ridicule him. Lord John Russell set the example. Personally, the Minister was to be kindly treated. Politically, he was negligible. He was there to be put aside. London and Paris imitated Lord John. Every one waited to see Lincoln and his hirelings disappear in one vast debacle. All conceived that the Washington government would soon crumble, and that Minister Adams would vanish with the rest. This situation made Minister Adams an exception among diplomats. European rulers for the most part fought and treated as members of one family, and rarely had in view the possibility of total extinction. But the governments and society of Europe, for a year at least, regarded the Washington government as dead, and its ministers as nullities. Minister Adams was better received than most nullities because he made no noise. Little by little, in private, society took the habit of accepting him, not so much as a diplomat, but rather as a member of opposition, or an eminent counsel retained for a foreign government. He was to be received and considered, to be cordially treated as, by birth and manners, one of themselves. This curiously English way of getting behind a stupidity gave the Minister every possible advantage over a European diplomat. Barriers of race, language, birth, habit ceased to exist. Diplomacy held diplomats apart in order to save governments, but Earl Russell could not hold Mr. Adams apart. He was undistinguishable from a Londoner. In society few Londoners were so widely at home. None had such double personality and corresponding double weight. The singular luck that took him to Fryston to meet the shock of the Trent Affair under the sympathetic eyes of Monckton Milnes and William E. Forster never afterward deserted him. Both Milnes and Forster needed support and were greatly relieved to be supported. They saw what the private secretary in May had overlooked, the hopeless position they were in if the American Minister made a mistake, and, since his strength was theirs, they lost no time in expressing to all the world their estimate of the Minister's character. Between them, the Minister was almost safe. One might discuss long whether, at that moment, Milnes or Forster were the most valuable ally, since they were influences of different kinds. Monckton Milnes was a social power in London, possibly greater than Londoners themselves quite understood, for in London society, as elsewhere, the dull and the ignorant made a large majority, and dull men always laughed at Monckton Milnes. Every bore was used to talk familiarly about Dicky Milnes, the cool of the evening, and of course he himself affected social eccentricity, challenging ridicule with the indifference of one who knew himself to be the first wit in London and a maker of men, of a great many men. A word from him went far. An invitation to his breakfast table went farther. Behind his almost Falstaffian mask and laugh of Silenus, he carried a fine, broad, and high intelligence which no one questioned. As a young man he had written verses which some readers thought poetry, and which were certainly not altogether prose. Later, in Parliament, he made speeches, chiefly criticised as too good for the place and too high for the audience. Socially, he was one of 2 or 3 men who went everywhere, knew everybody, talked of everything, and had the ear of ministers. But, unlike most wits, he had a social position of his own that ended in a peerage, and he had a house in Upper Brook Street to which most clever people were exceedingly glad of admission. His breakfasts were famous, and no one liked to decline his invitations, for it was more dangerous to show timidity than to risk a fray. He was a voracious reader, a strong critic, an art connoisseur in certain directions, a collector of books, but above all he was a man of the world by profession, and loved the contacts, perhaps the collisions, of society. Not even Henry Brougham dared to do the things he did, yet Brougham defied rebuff. Milnes was the good nature of London, the Gargantuan type of its refinement and coarseness, the most universal figure of May Fair. Compared with him, figures like Hayward or Delane or Venables or Henry Reeve were quite secondary, but William E. Forster stood in a different class. Forster had nothing whatever to do with May Fair. Except in being a Yorkshireman, he was quite the opposite of Milnes. He had at that time no social or political position. He never had a vestige of Milnes's wit or variety. He was a tall, rough, ungainly figure, affecting the singular form of self-defence which the Yorkshiremen and Lancashiremen seemed to hold dear, the exterior roughness assumed to cover an internal, emotional, almost sentimental nature. Kindly he had to be, if only by his inheritance from a Quaker ancestry, but he was a friend 1 degree removed. Sentimental and emotional he must have been, or he could never have persuaded a daughter of Dr. Arnold to marry him. Pure gold without a trace of base metal, honest, unselfish, practical. He took up the Union cause and made himself its champion, as a true Yorkshireman was sure to do, partly because of his Quaker anti-slavery convictions, and partly because it gave him a practical opening in the House. As a new member he needed a field. Diffidence was not one of Forster's weaknesses. His practical sense and his personal energy soon established him in leadership, and made him a powerful champion, not so much for ornament as for work. With such a manager, the friends of the Union of England began to take heart. Minister Adams had only to look on as his true champions, the heavyweights, came into action, and even the private secretary caught, now and then, a stray gleam of encouragement as he saw the ring begin to clear for these burly Yorkshiremen to stand up in a prize fight likely to be as brutal as ever England had known. Milnes and Forster were not exactly lightweights, but Bright and Cobden were the hardest hitters in England, and with them for champions the Minister could tackle even Lord Palmerston without much fear of foul play. In society, John Bright and Richard Cobden were never seen, and even in Parliament they had no large following. They were classed as enemies of order, anarchists, and anarchists they were if hatred of the so-called established orders made them so. About them was no sort of political timidity. They took bluntly the side of the Union against Palmerston, whom they hated. Strangers to London society, they were at home in the American Legation, delightful dinner company, talking always with reckless freedom. Cobden was the milder and more persuasive. Bright was the more dangerous to approach, but the private secretary delighted in both, and nourished an ardent wish to see them talk the same language to Lord John Russell from the gangway of the House. With four allies such as these, Minister Adams stood no longer quite helpless. For the second time, the British Ministry felt a little ashamed of itself after the Trent Affair, as well it might, and disposed to wait before moving again. Little by little, friends gathered around the Legation who were no fair-weather companions. The old anti-slavery Exeter Hall Shaftesbury clique turned out to be an annoying and troublesome enemy, but the Duke of Argyll was one of the most valuable friends the Minister found, both politically and socially, and the Duchess was as true as her mother. Even the private secretary shared faintly in the social profit of this relation, and never forgot dining one night at the Lodge and finding himself after dinner engaged in instructing John Stuart Mill about the peculiar merits of an American protective system. In spite of all the probabilities, he convinced himself that it was not the Duke's claret which led him to this singular form of loquacity. He insisted that it was the fault of Mr. Mill himself, who led him on by assenting to his point of view. Mr. Mill took no apparent pleasure in dispute, and in that respect the Duke would perhaps have done better, but the secretary had to admit that though at other periods of life he was sufficiently and even amply snubbed by Englishmen, he could never recall a single occasion during this trying year when he had to complain of rudeness. Friendliness he found here and there, but chiefly among his elders, not among fashionable or socially powerful people, either men or women, although not even this rule was quite exact, for Frederick Cavendish's kindness and intimate relations made Devonshire House almost familiar, and Edward Stanley's ardent Americanism created a certain cordiality with the Stanleys of Alderley, whose house was one of the most frequented in London. Lorne, too, the future Argyll, was always a friend. Yet the regular course of society led to more literary intimacies. Sir Charles Trevelyan's house was one of the first to which young Adams was asked, and with which his friendly relations never ceased for near half a century, and then only when death stopped them. Sir Charles and Lady Lyell were intimates. Tom Hughes came into close alliance. By the time society began to reopen its doors after the death of the Prince Consort, even the private secretary occasionally saw a face he knew, although he made no more effort of any kind, but silently waited the end. Whatever might be the advantages of social relations to his father and mother, to him the whole business of diplomacy and society was futile. He meant to go home. Chapter 8